Yo, what's going on, Dragon Ballers? Welcome back to another episode of the strategy series. Today, I'm really excited because we're talking about how to play mid-range decks. This is my favorite type of deck in the game to play. So with that being said, guys, if you are new here, make sure to subscribe, hit that bell so you don't miss a video. If you want to help the channel out, there are many links in the description and in the info card in the top right corner. Notice I'm wearing the certified Dragon Baller shirt. Make sure to check out the merch store in the description. We also have the Patreon, the Gemmy app, where you can get some one-on-one coaching as well as some other Crossflow TCG merch. Also, check out the Dex Protection store to get your sleeves, binders, deck boxes, all that good stuff. That being said, let's get started. So basically, my background in mid-range decks have been my most successful decks in the Dragon Ball Super card game as far as competitive events are concerned. I did very well with Surge Goku and Skillless Goku at two different events with 250 plus players. I was able to get third place at both of them after Top Cut. So I do know a little bit what I'm talking about when it comes to mid-range. It's my favorite type of deck to play, and it's really because of the mechanical reasons. It's not because, like, I think the cards are cool. It's because of the core fundamentals of how mid-range plays, which we are going to get into right now. So the mid-range mindset, it is a Swiss Army knife style of play. What that means is your deck can do a little bit of everything. You might not be the best at this or the best at that, but you can do it. And that actually goes a long distance when we're talking about, you know, playing a competitive tournament, coming across many different matchups. You need to be able to do many different things. And what that kind of consists of is having the right combination of proactivity and reactivity. So what this kind of means is a lot of times with these mid-range decks, you have the ability to kind of flip a switch. You can become a lot more proactive, and when you need to be, you can be a lot more reactive. You might also want to think about this in the sense of proactivity being a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more aggression, and then reactivity being a little bit more control-y, taking that control route as the opponent in the game. So you have the ability to do both when you need to. Now, the mid-range deck is for the player who doesn't want to auto lose to anything. And I was just talking about that a few minutes ago, where I was talking about the Swiss Army knife style of mid-range, where you can do a little bit of everything. You have good answer cards, you have aggression, you have the ability to pivot. And what I mean by this is you don't want to auto lose to anything, is that you have a stake in every matchup. There are not many matchups for many mid-range decks that are automatically lost. And one example I think about this is back to the ARG Invitational that I got third place with Skillless Goku. Shenron Gogeta was the deck to beat that format by far. It was one of the best decks alongside Broly Height of Mastery, both of which were not positive matchups for Skillless Goku. Now, I think it took a particularly knowledged Skillless Goku player to beat those matchups. You had to be very aggressive. You had to know the right tech cards to play and honestly when to play them at the right time. And of course, it was an uphill battle, but I had to beat several Brolys and several Shenron Gogetas to get into that top cut, and then eventually ended up losing Shenron Gogeta and got third place. That's a whole different thing. But anyways, yeah, there are uphill battles for mid-range decks, but no matchup is unwinnable because your deck is so flexible, because you're able to do so many different things. It just takes that knowledge to know when you need to do them. And that kind of brings us into the next point. This kind of deck highly rewards knowledge of the format and opposing decks. So basically, knowing what each deck in the room is going to do, knowing what your opponent's aggro deck does, knowing what your opponent's control deck does, knowing what your opponent's mid-range deck does, knowing what they do and the tech cards you have to play to stop them. Because as a mid-range deck, you have a lot more room in your main deck than most other decks. When you're a control deck, when you're an aggro deck, you have to play very specific cards to fill those very specific roles. But mid-range is a lot more flexible in that sense, where you have a lot more room in your deck to play a lot more tech cards that do a lot of different things. Like in Mono Yellow, for example, you have Raider's Warcry. That's an aggression tool. That's also a defensive tool by comboing defensively, tapping a guy, and drawing a card. You have Chomp of the Trickster. You have your one-drop crit attackers, your one-drop double strike attackers, your unisons that pair with your Dispo crit. So you can see what I'm saying when I say you have a lot of offensive tools and a lot of defensive tools. Knowing what to include in your deck to go against the format is really key. Another good example of this, you'll see many blue decks across all the different YouTube channels for Dragon Ball, across all the Facebook pages. They're not playing Ultra Instinct Son Goku, the Unstoppable, and the reason for that is there are not too many boss monsters in the format, thanks to Gogeta 7 being banned, that have barriers. So they can kind of put UI to the sideboard if they don't have to play if they don't want to, and Trunks Godsealing technique is good enough. And a lot of the good blue players, they kind of recognize that they don't need the UI Goku. So that's kind of knowing what you need in a specific environment. The next point, you want to feel like you win your games because you outplay your opponents. Now, before I explain this, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying aggro and control are not skill intensive, but sometimes you run into the case where your opponent just can't win because you're playing aggro or because you're playing control. When you're playing aggro, if your opponent's playing a glass cannon type of strategy, they really just can't play the defense to stop your aggression. They just automatically lose to it. If you're playing control deck, your opponent can't generate multiple actions per turn. You just shut them down every single turn. You're going to win as a control deck with very little interaction. When it comes to mid-range, you're all about interaction. You're all about reacting what your opponent's doing. You're all about trying to get a reaction out of your opponent by being proactive. So with that being the case, there are a lot of micro decisions in the mid-range deck, whereas let's say a control deck, for example, yeah, you have to make a decision of what your win condition is going to be and how you're going to stop your opponent's actions every single turn. But with the mid-range deck, and every single turn, there are many micro actions, micro decisions in those turns that are going to make or break your gameplay and your win or loss streak. With that being said, though, mid-range decks can be less punishing than other decks when you misplay. You'll hear a lot of high-level players in this game say when you misplay as the aggro deck, even when you're playing like super OP Universe 3 Veg X, if you made a crucial misplay, it can really cost you the game, because a lot of times in aggro, you're dedicating so many of your resources to killing and damaging your opponent that if you fail or mess up in some way, you're not going to have the amount of combo power to defend and survive another turn. Likewise, you're probably not playing a ton of negates since you are playing aggro. You want to be all gas. And then control, if you make a counterplay at the wrong time, your opponent gets a chance to do what they need to do, you can lose right then and there. That being said, though, take a card like Raider's Warcry, for example. Let's say the correct play was to combo offensively and then attack into a unison to clear it. Well, let's say you didn't do that. Well, that Raider's Warcry is still very good on defense, so you're not necessarily out of the game because of that mistake. But like I said before, making the best decision at all those micro decisions, that is going to be the key when it comes to winning a big tournament or even a local with a mid-range deck. So I do want to make that point clear. Let's talk about the matchup spread. Aggro, you're generally going to have a high success rate. That's because while mid-range decks can pivot from aggro to defense very well, the majority of the time, the mid-range deck is very good at playing defense. You just play the types of cards that are good at all stages of the game. Like I keep talking about, Raider's Warcry. It's good as an early aggression tool. It's good as a late game defensive tool because it comes in and taps a card. Same thing with the negates you're playing. Same thing with Senzu Bean as a mid-range deck. You have all these different cards that are good at all stages of the game, and that helps a lot with aggro. You can use them in the early stages of the game, then use them in the later stages of the game to finish it off. Control is a little bit more tricky. Typically, you'll have a lower success rate, although this can vary depending on the deck you're playing. Now, let's take a deck like Blue Vegeta, for example, a deck I'm a really big fan of, but I have to admit that this deck cannot be aggressive before turn 3 or 4, depending on when you can drop Obuni. You really can't make too many pushes until you drop Obuni, but the first few turns of the game, you have to be more reactive and really just rely on your leader attack because you don't have that aggression that, let's say, Gotenks has with Raider's Warcry. That being said, against control, you sometimes need to be more aggressive. Otherwise, they just have like an unstoppable boss monster that sometimes you can or can't stop depending on what kinds of answer cards your deck is playing. So if your mid-range deck can pivot better to aggro than others, you'll probably have a better success rate against control than a mid-range deck that cannot pivot so well to aggro. Talking about combo, it really depends on a case-by-case basis what type of combo they're playing and what kind of answer cards you have in your deck. Let's say they're playing a combo like AOD where they go wide on the board. Well, if you have a counterplay like the Yamcha red counterplay for unisons, you can minus 15 to threats. That's really good against a go wide combo. Let's say your opponent's playing a Cell Xeno deck or like Gogeta 7 deck before it got banned. If you have Chomp the Trickster, if you have the God Sealing Trunks, if it isn't a deflect boss monster, that's going to be the type of card you need to stop that type of combo deck. So keeping that in mind there, it really does depend what you're playing in your mid-range deck. Mid-range mirror key factors: who can get the most value out of your cards? Can you generate 2-for-1s? Can you use one card to get rid of 1 or 2 or more cards on your opponent's board? That's going to mean a lot. When you have an all-in turn, a lot of times there's going to be a lot of back and forth between mid-range decks. A lot of times you're not going to be attacking the opponent's leader. You don't want to give them too many cards, but when you are able to have like a go-in turn, you really want to push it, because when you get to your opponent's 4 or less life and you keep attacking them with an onslaught, they're going to spend cards to not take that damage. So if you can make the deficit between your hand and your opponent's hand like 4 or 5 cards in your advantage, that's gonna work out pretty well for you. Next up, main and side decked finishers make a big difference in mid-range mirrors. A lot of times you won't main deck them because they're going to be dead against aggro, and they're not always great in the mirror depending on what types of answers your opponent plays, like I talked about before. But a side decked Fu Shrouded, a main deck Smoke Dragon, or an SS4 Vegeta SCR can be what you need against mid-range decks in specific scenarios. These are the boss monsters that control decks play that pretty much win them the game, and sometimes you need those to win out in a mid-range mirror. And another thing is, who stays healthier longer? while still maintaining a good hand size. And that's when you can play value cards like Senzu Bean. That's when you can play value cards like Raider's Warcry, like Bergamo Ferocious Roar, things like that that can really stifle the opponent's aggression. That's going to help a lot in the long run. Next up, as a mid-range deck, you need to know what to do going into each matchup. One of the key questions is, should you be the aggressor or the defender? Now, there's kind of like a simple answer to this, but it gets a little bit more nitty-gritty as you play around with mid-range more. Generally, against control, you want to be the aggressor because their late game is better than yours. They have that basically, windmill boss monster slam that kind of wins in the game. And then against aggro, you want to be the defender because they have the better early game. The nice thing is your early and late game kind of balance out compared to control and aggro. So as long as you can turn the corner and get to where you need to get to, you should be able to pull the game in and win. Next up, do you have the answers to their boss cards? We just kind of talked about this. Do you have the Chomp the Trickster for their Cell Xeno? Do you have the Trunks God Sealing Technique for their Smoke Dragon? These are the important things you need to know. And like, for example, let's say you're playing mono yellow. Well, you don't really have too many things that can deal with a black Smoke Dragon as mono yellow. So maybe siding a blue package, or maybe adapting a 10 card blue package to play Frost Poison. That can go a long way in your mid-range deck. And like I mentioned before, mid-range is very flexible, at least in the deck building part of it all. How do you win the matchup? Usually through resource attrition, like I talked about before. When you have the all-in turn your opponent, you make them pitch 4, 5, 6 cards in order to not lose or not take too much damage, and then from there you're in the advantage, and then playing out that advantage is very important. Like I said before, you're not always going to play the huge boss monsters, but sometimes you need the main deck, side deck boss monsters in order to win certain matchups. Next thing you want to do, leave up the appropriate energy based off what the opponent should do on their next turn. We talked about this. Knowing what the decks do in the format is very important. If you know your opponent's playing Veg X, for example, they're going to be playing a 3-drop Veg X fusion. What are you going to do to stop that? You're going to Chomp the Trickster it, you're going to Crusher Ball, Giant Ball, or just negate the attack. Having the appropriate energy to deal with that when you can't make too aggressive of a push is very important. Now, we did this in the last video, a little matchup quiz. I want you guys to look at the two leaders here. Pause the video if you need to. Think about how this matchup will play out, and then I'm going to talk about it. So firstly, you have to identify the roles of both decks. On the right, we have Boo. He's definitely the aggressor in this matchup. I mean, it's just an aggressive deck in general. And then we have Gotenks on the left, definitely our mid-range deck, but we want to be defensive in this matchup because we know that Boo has a better early game than us. One thing that's really important with Gotenks, I never take life with the unawakened side of Gotenks unless I'm playing against pure control that wants to crit me or wants to never attack my leader. Those are the two times I'm generally going to take life with Gotenks. Besides that, I'm going to let my opponent deal all the damage because I don't need to take life to draw cards, and I want the game to go longer because if the game goes longer against a deck like Boo, I'm going to be advantaged. They're going to lose out on all their aggressive resources as time goes on, where I'm only going to generate more resources and a bigger board like Raider's Warcries, Bergamos, things like that as the game goes on. Next up, we're talking about Veg X versus U7 Goku. Again, pause the video if you need to. Take a second to think about it. So here, we have Veg X as the mid-range deck. We have U7 Invoker as the control deck. Once upon a time, Veg X was degenerate broken aggro. Not so much anymore. The way it plays out now is you're definitely a lot slower as Veg X, and that honestly can hurt a lot against a deck like U7 Invoker because they have a card like Royal Condemnation, Emperor's Death Beam to deal with your Veg X fusions. Those are going to be your main plays as Veg X now. And honestly, if you go second, they set up their Vegeta Invoker, you're going to have a pretty rough time. So you really do want to try and go lower to the ground if you can, relying on those free play Vegetas, relying on a card like Goku Xeno. It's a little bit cheaper, lower to the ground. So at least if they counterplay it, you don't lose out on too much. You only lose out on like 1 energy and 1 card. So you kind of want to adjust that way, like I talked about with the fluid play style of mid-range. Next up, we have Blue Vegeta versus a deck like Green Frieza Hand Control. So we have a mid-range deck on the left, Blue Vegeta, and a hand control deck on the right, Green Frieza. The interesting thing here is, as Vegeta, you're mostly going to awaken turn 1 most games, and you're going to have a high life total. So Frieza is going to be on their unawakened side for quite a while, attacking your leader, making discard cards, and they're not actually going to deal damage to you because you're going to be at 15k to their 10k. Now the thing is, they're going to try and crit you a lot with their unisons thanks to the awakened leader effect or their other crits in the deck. And with that being the case, you definitely want to negate the crits when you can. Use like a Roshi or Dimension Magic to save those crits and then get the life to your hand via them attacking you or some cards in your deck that take life like the Vegeta Double Striker, things like that. It's a very, very winnable matchup. The other nice thing is if you go really late in the game, you have your Unison on board, you can activate battle multiple times to finish the game out against Frieza and kind of make up for that combo power that you lost with Frieza kind of ripping your hand apart. So guys, that's going to go for today with the strategy series for playing mid-range. I want to know in the comments below what you guys think. Did you enjoy this video? let me know. Thanks for watching. I will see you guys next time.